I will wait for your cue. How's everybody doing this morning? Survived the evening? I've heard rumblings that there was great frivolity here last night. The weekend is still young. Conference is not over yet. We're good? Yes? Alright. Alright, let's get started. Good morning, everyone. My name's Jeff Man, if you haven't figured that out yet. I like to plaster my name everywhere because I'm an egocentric type person. Not really. Here's my contact information. Actually, wow, there's a typo there. How embarrassing. That's my passport picture from back when I was doing the things that you're going to hear about this morning, or shortly thereafter. So I used to be young and cool and hip and have hair and all that kind of stuff, living the hacker lifestyle. And it's Mr. Jeff Man, not Man. How embarrassing. We're all human. Yeah, it's a simple substitution. A little bit about my background. I mean, this talk today is basically I'm going to tell you stories about stuff I used to do a million years ago when I worked for the DoD. I got my start in the DoD in the mid-'80s, primarily at the National Security Agency. I was there for about 10 years. I sort of had 3 careers while I was there. I had 3 different sort of main assignments, and you'll hear about some of those assignments this morning. I left in '96, went out into the private sector, the real world. Started out as a pen tester, vulnerability assessments. Back in those days, it was convincing people why they needed to have a firewall if they were going to connect to the internet. And then you just start thinking about security in a different way, or even start thinking about security at all because they'd never really worried about it before. Somewhere along the line, I fell into PCI. I ended up being a QSA, a Qualified Security Assessor. I did that for about 10 years. And several years ago, I was approached by an old friend of mine and said, hey, I want you to come and work for my company, be a PCI subject matter expert, become an evangelist. You've been around a long time. You've got a lot of stories to tell. I want you to go out to conferences and start telling stories and sharing your infinite wisdom and knowledge. And I have a bunch of useless information in my head that I'd love to share with you. So that's pretty much why I'm here today. If you ever watch Security Weekly, securityweekly.com, I'm one of the co-hosts there. And when I can, I go to the studio or I Skype in. Haven't been on much lately because I've been on the road a lot. And I am a Jedi Master. I do get the Stormtrooper escorts occasionally when I speak at conferences. So, but enough with that. I got my start primarily in InfoSec, working at the National Security Agency. And as I said, I sort of had 3 different jobs there, starting with cryptography, moving on to doing basically analytical work, InfoSec work. Cryptanalysis I did on what was considered both sides of the operations of NSA. We just used to call it offense and defense. But what people know NSA more for, what little we know about NSA, is that they're the ones that intercept communications and try to figure out what all of our adversaries and other nation states are saying so that we can, find out their secrets. That's the offense. The defense, which technically doesn't even exist anymore, they've dissolved the organization, but the defense was protecting our own communication. Went on into fielded systems analysis, which is what we got me into computer security, network security, penetration testing, so on and so forth. To put things in context, when I started at NSA, that was still a secret. Anybody want to tell me what that is? It's the Enigma machine. Anybody want to wager a guess as to why it was still a secret that we knew how to break that system? People were still using it. And by people, certain nation states. We didn't call them nation states back then. We called them the Soviet Union, basically. But yeah, there was some people that were still using it in the mid 80s, 40 some years, 45, 50 years after the cryptography had been broken, which is a good example on the need for secrecy. And I try to explain to people very often when I can that what makes things top secret in terms of this whole national security thing is not so much the data and the information that's collected. It's what we call the methods and the sources. If back in the 30s or 40s, I forget the exact year when the Enigma was broken, if the fact that it had been broken was that even that piece of information had been leaked, if that had been discovered by the people that used the Enigma machine, they would have stopped using it. And 40 years of collection of information from that source would have dried up. That's a source of information. That's what's usually the top secret, the sensitive part of what you want to protect. First career, NSA Tales version 1. I got a job initially at NSA because I went and took a bunch of aptitude tests and skills tests and psych exams, and I had to pee in a cup and take a polygraph and get a psych evaluation. Did all sorts of things. But I scored well on the aptitude test, so they decided to hire me. When I first started, I didn't really actually have an assignment, which was kind of weird, but back in the 80s, this was the Reagan administration, this is when we were building up our Defense Department to try to squash the Soviet Union, and we ended up winning that war, so to speak, the Cold War, because we outspent them. We bankrupted them, essentially. So I was hired at a time when NSA was hiring about 100 people a week on average. And then I had to look for a job. So I went on a series of interviews, even though I was already employed by the agency. And I want to tell this story. I was thinking about this morning. If there's any recruiters in the room or anybody that's involved with staffing, I want to tell this tale, just as a, I don't know, put it in the back of your mind, or if you're listening on the recording later. There was this office called the Manual Crypto Systems Branch. Their responsibility was for producing and maintaining all the paper-based crypto systems that NSA was producing. NSA in the mid-'80s was already into at least mass reproduction of documents. We didn't have computers as much as we had word processors. Printers were becoming more available. So it wasn't the old, and you have to be old to know what this is, mimeograph, carbon copies, making documents very manually and tediously. We started to have printers. But all these things were happening in terms of technological advances that people sort of assumed that paper would naturally go away. There was more machine crypto systems being produced. There was more, high tech even for then. And at some point they made a realization, geez, paper hasn't gone away. It's actually proliferated because it's faster to print it and it's easier and more cost effective to print it. A lot of paper systems were still being used. So this office, which was on the defensive side, they wanted to do evaluations of the crypto systems to make sure that they were still cryptographically secure. They wanted to do, basically friendly testing of them, analysis of them to make sure that they were still protecting U.S. communications, DoD communications. So they wanted a cryptanalyst. To look for a cryptanalyst, they went to the other side of the house, the offense, because that's where all the cryptanalysts were. They couldn't find anybody that was interested, and there's long, boring stories about the reason why people in ops, the offensive side, didn't really care much about the defensive side. But suffice it to say, they couldn't find any cryptanalyst that was interested in coming over and doing this mundane task of looking at our own systems, because they had more important things to do, or whatever. So they ended up saying, well, if we can't find one, we'll grow one. So they interviewed me, and they brought me in, and they said, we want you to become a cryptanalyst. So I tell that story because they hired somebody that basically didn't have any experience. I didn't have credentials. I didn't have certifications. I just scored well on a couple aptitude tests. And they said, you look like you've got some of the raw skills. Are you willing to do this? And I said, yeah, that sounds like fun. So I became a cryptanalyst, and I became a cryptanalyst doing manual crypto systems. Things like these are called one-time pads. This is sort of the primary paper system that was used and might possibly still be used by some divisions of our military. It's used because it's secure. It cannot be broken if it's used correctly. More on that later. They also, at the time, produced a lot of paper systems that was used for authentication. We called them call signs. You know, if you're talking to somebody, usually back then it was on a radio, and you wanted to make sure you knew who you were talking about, you would have a secret set of, letters and numbers, something that you would say. It was called a challenge, and they would have the same thing, spin the dial, and they knew how to provide the right response. So a challenge and response was an authentication method. Systems like this were used obviously by radio operators, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force. They had to get special ones. I don't know if anybody's ever been in the Air Force, but when you're a pilot, you have a pocket on your thigh, and it's kind of like a clear plastic, so they could put that and slide it in, because you can imagine in a jet there's a lot of stuff going on, so they don't have a whole lot of time to throw out a paper and pad. So they'd use a grease pencil and write on their leg to, mark off whatever the call sign was. That's the kind of stuff we were producing. In the time that I was there, we advanced into doing some more electronic type of stuff. Those things on the left, if you're younger people, they're called telephones. These were actually secure telephones. They took a voice signal, which is traditionally analog. They would actually record a digital signal, encrypt it, send it, decrypt it, and it was almost like real time. And usually when you were talking on one of these things, the person you were talking to kind of sounded like Donald Duck. So it wasn't perfect, but it was encrypted. And those little plastic keys on the right, that was the actual key that was embedded in those things, and you'd literally stick it in the phone, turn it a quarter turn, and that's how you keyed the device. I gave a version of this talk last week to a group called Hack for Kids. Shout out to Hack for Kids. They wanted to learn a little bit about the basics cryptography, and I thought, there's probably grown-ups that would like to hear this too. So if you can indulge me for a few minutes, I'm going to give you a really brief whirlwind tour of how manual cryptanalysis works, manual cryptography works. Okay? Traditionally, and this is something that should not be new to us in the field, there's 3 reasons why you want to protect data, and that's confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Confidentiality is simply keeping it secret, keeping your information secret. Integrity, assuring that the data is real, ensuring that it hasn't been altered or modified in some way. In a military sense, that becomes important. Let's say if you're trying to call in an airstrike on an enemy area and you're calling in grid coordinates. In the old days it was latitude, longitude. Nowadays it's a GPS coordinate. But if somebody's intercepting that, or if somebody's pretending to be the person calling in the airstrike and giving the wrong coordinates, or somehow intercepts the coordinates and alters them, bombs might be falling in places you don't want them to fall. So integrity. Availability, we think of that in modern terms of denial of service. Can I get to the data when I want to? In terms of manual cryptography, in terms of classic crypto systems, paper-based systems, there's 2 types, codes and ciphers. We use these terms today in the modern world sort of interchangeably. We talk about encoding, encryption, codes, ciphers, like it's all the same thing. Not to belabor the point, but they're actually different from an historical perspective. Codes, I've been in this business a long time, and I even have to struggle sometimes to remember the difference, but codes are basically a way to replace your message with something else completely that has some sort of random meaning, but there's an association. Think of like a list where you have a set of words and you substitute just some other random words, but you have a lookup list. These were typically called code books. Typically, codes were used to replace words or phrases, and there's certain phrases you can imagine in the military that are fairly common, like call in an airstrike, or sound the charge to go to battle, call a retreat. There's certain things that you say every day, and they would abbreviate that. One of the purposes of codes even today, because codes are still used, is usually for brevity. Make something long short. If you want to say, there's nothing going on, nothing's changed, everything's normal, you can shorten that to say, okay. Some things along those lines. Ciphers, on the other hand, is taking the data that's there, and basically you're not altering it, you're not replacing it with anything, you're doing one of 2 things. You're scrambling the order of the data, usually character at a time, or maybe a couple characters at a time. And that's called transposition. You're transposing the order. Or you're doing something called substitution, which you're replacing typically letter for letter. Again, sometimes there's some variations, but you're substituting a letter for a different letter. So you're trying to confuse people by, well, that doesn't look like the word. What could it be? The classic example of this would be from ancient history, the Caesar cipher, which is simply taking the alphabet and replacing it with an offset of the same alphabet. So substitution and transposition, changing the order or substituting usually letter for letter. Best example of codes that I can think of is World War II, where the Navajos were enlisted to work with the radio operators. They became radio operators, mostly in, I believe, the Pacific Theater. This was against the Japanese. And they did two things. One is, what we usually hear about, is they talked in their native language, which apparently is a very hard language to learn. And the Japanese struggled in understanding and just trying to simply learn their language. But what was more significant was they used a code book. They used their words to replace the words that they had intended to use. I don't know how well you can read this, but to just give you a few examples, like down on the bottom, they're talking about sort of naval terms, like a ship. They would call a ship a sea force. So whatever Navajo word that meant sea force, that referred to ships. A battleship, they used their word for whale. So instead of saying send a battleship over, they'd say send a whale over, substituting a word for something else. That's probably the most famous example of a code book. Everybody ever seen the movie National Treasure? Fun movie. I liked it because I'm a crypty. It's all full of puzzles. But they have this thing in there called the Ottendorf cipher, where the encrypted message that's on the back of the Declaration of Independence, a series of numbers, translates to a set of letters that were written by Benjamin Franklin, and they have to go to the Franklin Museum in Philadelphia. They send this little kid in, and the numbers represent, I'm not going to remember the specifics, like which letter, which paragraph. I think it's paragraph on a page, which word, which letter, something like that. So even I still struggle. Is that a code or a cipher? Because they're using a separate document, but they're really going after one letter. So technically I could argue this is a cipher, but I could also think of it as a code. If they'd have gone in there and written down a word instead of a letter, I'd call it a code. So that's just meant to confuse you. Common examples of codes that exist in the world today that some of these are sort of archaic, and if you're a millennial or younger, but in the old days when I was a kid, you lived in an area, you dialed a phone number, you dialed 7 digits. And somewhere along the line, you had to add the area code, the first 3 digits. Young people today probably don't know that the 10 digits used to be 7, although I think there's some areas in the country you can still do 7 digits. But those 3 digits mean a particular area of the country. Mail, the zip code when you send a package, or you send nobody writes letters anymore. You send a document. The zip code simply translates to a particular post office in a particular area. That's a short way of saying, I grew up in 20904, which is the White Oak Post Office in Silver Spring, Maryland, United States of America. 20904 does it for you. Ham radios, anybody a ham radio operator? There's Q codes. I may shout out a few Q codes. I'm not a ham operator, but what does QRM mean? Okay, cool, thank you. And I'm sure there's a whole lot more. I hope that's not your favorite because you get a lot of machine interference. Even in computer terms, ASCII, converting letters to digits. I mean, that's an example really of a code. And my favorite things is moving on to the ciphers. A transposition is substituting the letters. They're in a different order. I think it was the ancient Greeks, they came up with this idea where they'd take a strip of leather and they'd have a block of wood that was of a particular size. They'd make 2 of them. They'd take a strip of leather and wrap it around, write their message line by line, unwind it, and then they had these letters in sort of a random order, and they'd either send the leather strap, and you had to have the same size stick to wrap it around again to read it. But if you were just holding this strip, you, in theory, had no way of figuring out what the message was. This other example is called a grill substitution or grill transposition, where you have a table that's blank, and then you have like a cardboard cutout that has certain holes cut out of it. Almost looks like a crossword puzzle. You put it down, you write your message letter for letter. When you run out, you turn it a quarter turn. So, picture in your mind it's doing a quarter turn clockwise. You write more letters, keep going, turn it a quarter turn, and keep going till you finish your message. You lift it up, your letters in a supposedly random order that nobody can figure out what it says. This is an example of the Caesar cipher. It was used during the Civil War. This is actual picture of a cipher wheel or a cipher disc that was used by the Confederate Army in the Civil War. What you could do with this when you've turned it into a wheel is you could do it different offsets. We call it rotation or rot. Rot 13 is 13 offsets. That's what the Caesar cipher was. It was 13 offsets. But you can do one of 25 or one of 26, but technically the 26th one, you're not doing any encryption. Those of you who are older might remember these things called newspapers, and in the newspapers there used to be a funny page, and the funny page would have puzzles and activities like crypto quizzes, crypto quotes. Those were usually examples of simple substitution. They were Caesar ciphers. Another version, and there's many, but one that was near and dear to my heart, because I might have used this at some point, was something called a substitution cipher called a Playfair square. The Playfair square was you'd start with some sort of keyword, and that could change daily, weekly. You would write it out in usually a 5x5 square, and you would only use each letter once. You don't use repeat letters if the word had repeated letters, and you use the rest of the alphabet and fill it up. There's 26 letters in the alphabet. Usually I or J or Q got combined because those letters aren't used very commonly. Then when you have a message, you split it up 2 letters at a time, and you basically do, the rule was 2 letters, you find A and T, and if they're in a different quadrant, different row column, you find the letters that make it into a square, and it was top to bottom, left to right was the rule, if that made sense. But you just complete the square, so AT becomes RS. If there's an instance where they're on the same row, you would use the letters immediately below. If they ended up on the same column, you went to the right. You could reverse that. The person on the other end, you didn't have to send him anything. He just had to know what the keyword was to fill out his square. The way cryptography works, or the way it did classically to break these types of systems, is you did a lot of statistical analysis. In the English language, certain letters happen more commonly than others, and this is just an example of some text that I did a frequency analysis on. You can imagine that E is the most common letter of the alphabet, followed usually by T, N, O, R, I, A, S. We used to call it the Etnarias letters. They were the most common. The vowels, there's only 5 of them. Obviously, they're going to be used a lot, but some are used more often than not. When you do a transposition, if you're counting up all the characters, since they haven't changed, you're going to see this same distribution. So it's just a matter of knowing how do you unscramble it. When you're doing a substitution, I'm going to walk through an example. Here's the preamble of the Constitution, and here's the frequency count. When you do a simple substitution, you're changing the letters, but you're not changing the characteristics. So in this instance, what's the most common letter? You can see it's Y. So if we were trying to break this cipher, we might guess, well, maybe the Y is an E. So you look up in the top there, and we know what it says, right? It's the preamble. We, the people of the United States. There's a lot of E's in that already. And we can see already that, hey, those letters that's E. What you would then do is, assuming you didn't know what the underlying text was, if you just looked at something like that, let me go backwards, you have a short 3-letter word that ends in E. Now, just intuitively, what short 3-letter word in the English language that ends in E? Can you think of any? The. Turns out that's what it is. The does not end in E. But that's what I used to do. That was cryptanalysis. Look for patterns, look for common letters, and try to figure things out. I was very fortunate at the end of my first job to be given these books. I used to use these books. These were considered Bible. They were written by a gentleman named William Friedman, who's sort of the godfather of cryptography, at least at NSA, and another gentleman named Lambros Kalimahos. These guys were brilliant. These guys were geniuses. They did lots of statistical analysis. We didn't always know it, and that's what's in these volumes. They were formally classified. They were declassified, and afterwards, if you want to come take a look at them, feel free, but handle with care. As people figured out that their simple messages were getting broken, they tried to complicate things, and there's many variations. That's why there's 2 volumes of books there. You started by, instead of just using the alphabet in regular order, you start using some sort of keyword to try to confuse it a little bit, make it harder to figure out. So, in this case, I used the word crypto. Similar to the Playfair, use up the letters, end up using the rest of the alphabet. And again, you can do 26 different slides. You could also, depending on what alphabet it is, use more than one alphabet. Decide you're going to do 2, 3, 4, 5 alphabets to try to confuse and make it harder for somebody to just straightforward try to guess the letters. Because let's walk through an example. Here's the same preamble to the Constitution. I'll tell you that up front. So look up there where it's we the people. That letter and that letter should be the same thing, but it's not. Look at the distribution. I did the same character count. What jumps out now is the E. It's kind of harder to tell. I mean, the T there is still the highest one, but, where do you see T's up there? It's and we know, since, we're cheating, we the people of the United States, the T is barely showing up in the first place there. And it's certainly not repeating the way that we would expect it to see. So I'm going to walk you through real quickly an exercise of how we would try to break out and figure out, okay, this is not just a simple substitution. There's something else going on here. So I went through and did counts starting with, let's do 2 alphabets. And I did the frequency counts. On the left is English frequency distribution, the original, and the way the message looked when we first just did it straight off the bat. So 2 alphabets. Those are the frequencies on the right there, and there's your reference on the left. Does it look like it's a 2-alphabet system? Do those frequency counts on the right look like the top left? No. Don't be afraid. Shout it out. So next I tried 3 alphabets. It's a little bit spikier, but if you notice, especially in the first 2 versions, every letter is used. That's not normal in English. I mean, it is possible that in a shorter message, the chances of using all 26 letters, and it looks like, some letters weren't just used once, but a couple times, that's really not likely. So hopefully you're with me. 3 alphabets doesn't look right either. So next I moved to 4 alphabets. Again, it's starting to be a little bit spikier, but the other thing that I should tell you that you might notice is if you look at English frequency distribution, there's the E that spikes, but there's if you sort of squint, there's sort of 4 different bumps, 4 different peaks. And there's several valleys, but there's sort of 4 peaks. If you look at the alphabets on the right, while it's spikier and there's more peaks and valleys, it's still kind of all over the map, which doesn't mean it's not scrambled, but there aren't really distinct patterns emerging similar to that. Are you with me so far? All right, 5 alphabets. That's starting to look a lot different, isn't it? Now we're starting to see peaks. Now we're starting to see valleys. I would guess, and hopefully you would guess with me, hey, I think we're on a 5-alphabet system. Now, I haven't broken the message yet, but now I know that there's probably 5 different alphabets, so let's try to apply that theory. So I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm just using the first part of the message, which we know says, we the people of the United States. So we know that these letters are the letters E in the plain text. What you do when you're doing 5 alphabets, each letter gets encrypted with a different alphabet. So for convenience, 1 through 5. So the second letter, which is the second alphabet, is the letter M. You look at the frequency count. Hey, look, M's the most common letter. I think we might be on the right track. Go on to the next word, the E in the word the, which is the 5th alphabet. You go over there and they're like, oh, V's not the most frequent letter. It's still kind of spiky, but it's not the most frequent. Well, that's okay. It's not completely off, but it doesn't really give me 100% confidence. So let's move on. There's another 2. There's the first alphabet, the G, which is an E at the end of people. Let's look up at the first alphabet. Whoa! G's up there. By then I'm saying, I'm feeling pretty confident that I know 5 alphabets. I still have to unscramble the alphabet. I still have to figure out what the underlying word is. But now I can start guessing letters and looking for patterns based on, I know that there's 5 alphabets and they're related. They're different offsets of each other. And I go on and hopefully can break the message. Oh yeah, I'm supposed to have that to catch up with what I'm doing. So, essentially the way classic crypto systems were broken was a lot of statistics and a lot of analysis. It's a lot of guessing, looking for patterns. And of course, you weren't always looking at the English language as the underlying plain text. Use your imagination what language was probably of interest in the 80s. And the Soviet Union was a country of many different countries with many different languages. So it wasn't just Russian. There was other languages out there. These days, you can imagine that a common language that we might be interested in would be Arabic. Yep. So Arabic is a kind of an interesting language because the script is a little bit different, but Arabic can be converted to binary and it has to be converted to characters, so there is an Arabic alphabet, and a lot of this stuff still applies. What really raised the bar, though, in terms of manual cryptanalysis and cryptography was the idea of a one-time pad. You introduce a key, you introduce a stream of random, and what makes a one-time pad works is you use the key one time. If you use the key only one time, you have no way of breaking it because there is no predictability, there is no reuse. Every character is basically encrypted with some random character. You could decrypt it to say anything, and you could make it valid. So the preamble to the Constitution, if it was encrypted with the one-time pad, and you were just guessing what it might be, you could come up with, I don't know, green eggs and ham, and make it valid, because you don't know. You have no way of basing what your answer is, whether it's right or not. The particular one-time pad that was used most often by the military had to use an algorithm. An algorithm is simply a method of encryption. The one-time pad algorithm was something called a Vigenère square. A Vigenère square, Vigenère was a French guy back in like the 1700s. He came up with this idea of using a table to represent the 26 offsets of the alphabet, but he wrote the alphabet in a row and a column and then filled in the table. What this does, in this particular one, and this is very important, uses a reverse alphabet to fill the contents of the table. When you do this and you think of going down the row, or going down the column, picking a letter, going across the rows, picking a letter, and sort of connecting it to the middle, you're creating a 3-letter combination. And that will be important, and I'll show you in a minute. And it actually produces 132 unique 3-letter combinations. So the way a one-time pad worked was each page is essentially a page of key. It's random. It's printed a character at a time. They group it in 5 characters because when you're transmitting, when you're saying this on a radio, or they really actually used to use Morse code, teletype devices, bursts of 5 are things that people can remember. And there's less likely to make mistakes, or there's less likely to not hear it right. So you would write a message letter for letter, and you never used the first 5 characters, because the first 5 characters was what was called the page indicator. So the person on the other end, he needs to know which page to use. And in theory, it would be the top page, because you use a page once, you throw it away, you eat it, whatever, you destroy it. But just in case it's lost in transmission and they get out of order, you need to have that page indicator so you know this is the right page to use to decrypt. And what you do is, using that table, you go through and you find your 2 letters and figure out what the 3rd letter is, and that becomes your cipher. So each 2 letters gets a 3rd letter. You write that down. That's your message. Now, the magic of it, the beauty of it is, when you get on the other end, you've got the same page. You've identified your message with the page indicator. You write down your letters. The same 2 letters, or any 2 letters, provides the 3rd letter, in no matter what the order is. So the table, you do it in reverse, and you get back to your message. The 3 letters then are plain text, key, and cipher. Or cipher, key, and plain text. And it doesn't matter what order they are. You had a question? Thank you. Typically when you were using a one-time pad, similar to teletype and Morse code, the one thing you did was you didn't use a period, you would say stop. So they would know that that was the end of a sentence, that was the end of a thought. And when you were at the end of your message, you would typically use a repeating character, X for example, and you'd repeat it several times so the person on the other end that's decrypting says, oh, I can stop now. Because that's a tedious process to do it by paper and look it up and do the whole thing. So it's like, oh, I can stop now. So it was just an indicator, end of message. What happens from a statistical standpoint when you encrypt with using random, you totally obliterate the characteristics. There is no way to figure out what that is. That picture, this is actually a real page from a one-time pad. The Visionaire square was printed on one side. The 132 3-letter combinations were printed on the other side. My customer would memorize these, and they would do the encryption and decryption in their head. So that was a special page. It was the first page of every one-time pad. The guys that I used to work with, they would shrink it, they would laminate it. It was in their wallet. It was in that pocket in their leg. And they would very often just sit out and just be memorizing the characters, because that really sped up the process. I was working with them, and I didn't have it memorized. I was using the different tables, and I'll show you in a minute what I did to solve that. But move on to some more stories. One of the things I did when I was in this manual cryptosystem office, we'll have to fly through this, was I was called a ComSec custodian. It was very important in the security of encryption systems to protect the key. There was a lot of focus on the physical protection of the key, so we had these things called ComSec accounts, custodians, that would basically, we were responsible for keeping all the paper under lock and key, and we had processes and procedures for distributing that key to the intended recipient. Couriers, controlled mail, trusted delivery people, and it all had to be signed off and checked and verified and 2-person control. There was process to make sure that that key was not being compromised. Because there is one way to break a one-time pad: steal the key. That's the only way. So the most important thing about the security of a one-time pad is to keep the key safe, keep it secret, make sure it's not getting copied, make sure it's not being stolen. Some of the devices that I used to work with, this was mostly the office next to me. I did paper, but some of the systems that were out there, this is one of the radios that they used to use, where they started to apply cryptography to the voice. And in the early days, it was analog. And then later on, we came up with devices that would convert the analog signal to digital. It's a little bit easier speed-wise to encrypt a digital signal than an analog signal. And more importantly, when you're decrypting it on the other end, it sounds a little bit more normal, and you can hear what people are saying a little bit better. This was, one of the techniques was to try to prevent people from stealing the signal, was coming up with, this is called frequency hopping. During the course of the transmission, the portions of the transmission would be sent on different radio frequencies, and it would hop all around, supposedly randomly. Of course, the other side figured out, oh, they're hopping frequencies, so they came up with ways of predicting and trying to track or at least monitor a larger field. A lot of this game of security in the DoD sense is cat and mouse. We've come up with something, they figure out how to defeat it. And of course, we were doing the same thing. Keys started being produced electronically. These are early key distribution systems. The keys would get inserted or injected into these devices. This is what NSA, most of the defense did of NSA, was we would be designing and building these types of systems. And these systems were boxes, little black boxes. The cryptography within these boxes was self-contained. It was tamper-protected. We used to refer to plain text as red and cipher as black. And so there was a red input and a black output. And you didn't know what was going on inside. That was where all the crypto was happening. In modern terms, we might call this firmware. Back then, we called it hardware. When we started, I had a chief scientist say, there's really no such thing as software. It's all hardware. That's what NSA did. Anybody remember who this guy is? Ollie North. This is totally random, and I didn't tell this to the kids because they have no idea who this guy is. He got in trouble a little bit. He was sort of the fall guy. We don't need to get into the long and short of it. But one of the things he did, he was working in the White House. He contacted NSA and asked for some secure communications equipment so that he could distribute to some of the people that he was allegedly talking to in the whole thing that he did. The ComSec account that he got his equipment from was the ComSec account that I was the custodian for. It wasn't me at the time, but I have sort of two degrees of separation from Ollie North, for what it's worth. I had that chief scientist, as I said, say there's only hardware. But I had a customer very, very early on, and they were affiliated with some of the armed forces. Initially, it was the Air Force. They were using these one-time pads. These one-time pads were being used to communicate with people that were, say, friendly to us, that might be citizens of other countries. For simplicity's sake, we'll say they were spies. And the spies, they would have one-time pads that were usually about an inch and a half long, maybe a half an inch deep, and it was literally designed so you could hide it in the heel of your shoe, very easily concealable. Those one-time pads were printed on rice paper, so they were edible. And they would literally eat it. Once they used the one-time pad, they would eat it to destroy it. Funny, sad story was one time we did a print run, and whoever ordered the ink to print the one-time pads failed to note whether the ink was edible or not. So while it was printed, we had one run of one-time pads that was printed on rice paper, but the ink was toxic. So 6 spies are not happy spies. But the guys that were handling them, the case officers that were in offices, that were in SCIFs, protected facilities, in safe places, they had a much larger pad. Their pad was basically legal size. But they were still complaining it took hours to encrypt and decrypt messages. And they had this thing sitting on their desk, and they said, surely there must be some way we can do this using that. And I said, yeah, I think we could. So we ended up producing a software-based encryption system. We wrote the algorithm in a computer program, and we put the one-time pad, which used to be printed on a paper, and put it on a floppy disk. And so the floppy disk became a one-time floppy disk. Now we had to come up with ways of deleting, destroying the page and make sure it was a page at a time. And, it was a stream of bits, so that we had to come up with ways of doing it. We had to come up with ways of doing secure deletion. That was a requirement. And so I went and asked for a secure deletion algorithm and found out there were none. So we had to come up with one. I essentially took standards that were written to produce hardware, and I had to rewrite them to produce software. Yes, ma'am. Okay. It was really on 3.5. Yep. Okay. To my knowledge, that was the first software-based encryption system that NSA ever produced. I was 24, 25 years old. I was young. I was new. And thank you. And I have to fly through the rest of this talk. And I had to talk with people. I had to go before basically the board of directors of the defensive side of NSA to pitch my idea and get them to approve it. Guys that were my age now, suits. But I did it. And I did something that people told me, you can't do that. So I was reflecting on this morning. I kind of hacked the process. I hacked the system. So to you younger people out there, don't ever let anybody tell you it can't be done. That's what a hacker does, is finds a way. So, did it again. I'm going to fly through this stuff. Another customer was Special Forces. Similar type of thing. They would communicate messages, broadcasting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, from base stations that could broadcast over entire hemispheres of the world. And you knew if you were a deployed team, like a SEAL team or an A team, to listen at a certain time, and that was your message. The one-time pad was printed on baud tape. It was put it into a machine that would convert it to a digital. You'd have a message that you had to type in that would print out on the tape, and you ran that same tape too. And there was another machine that took the two tapes and did the encryption and combined it into another tape that got fed into another machine that converted to an artificial voice that was fed to another machine that was recorded on reel-to-reel tape, and the tape was fed into a machine. It was broadcast. They said, we're going to fix that. Oh, and because I was working with all these guys and I didn't know that all the trigraphs, I came up with a cipher disk, and they ended up loving it, and we ended up making thousands of them. They've used it forever. I'll tell that story later. I was competing, it turns out, with the guy in the office next to me. He was trying to produce this really cool high-tech encryption system that showed 32 characters on an LCD. You'd type in your message, hit a button, it would magically encrypt. The guys I was working with, they're like, let's use laptops. Let's put the key on a floppy disk and do that. We did that. That's what we did. I went on to the ops side. I was there during Desert Shield, Desert Storm, which was a little desert encounter a few years before 9/11. There you go, Tom, the crypto statue. Wired Magazine had an article that talked about there was this guy at CIA that broke the code on this statue that's in the courtyard of CIA. This article came out and said, yeah, but there was this bunch of NSA interns that did it years before this other guy. I was one of those interns. There's a printout of the code, the cipher from the statue. The timestamp on it is September 27th of 1991, so there's proof. It's the third message that has not been decrypted yet, Tom. The last thing I did was I went to work for this fielded systems evaluation. This is that thing I was showing you earlier that was the first analog to digital. We decided, hey, we should be testing the security of our systems because we break other people's systems because they misuse them. They find shortcuts. They reuse key longer than they should or more than once. They find workarounds. They're lazy. Well, how do we know our guys aren't doing the same thing? That led to what was becoming very popular was network systems and looking at the security of networks. So that got me into penetration testing. So I went to work for this organization called the Systems and Network Attack Center. We were the center of excellence. We were supposed to know everything about hacking and vulnerabilities and security for networks. And we felt hopelessly overwhelmed because we were a few and the whole world was out there doing this stuff. A book came out last year called Dark Territory. In that book, there's a chapter 4 called Eligible Receivers. Does anybody know what eligible receiver was? No? Let me tell you. Eligible Receiver happened in 1997. It was the first DoD-wide, basically, pen test. It was a hack fest. The NSA hacked the entire military, and it was an operation called Eligible Receiver. I wasn't a part of it. I had left before that. But in that chapter, there's this paragraph that starts, the NSA had a similar group called the Red Team, yada, yada, yada. And I have to say this dramatically. During its most sensitive drills, the Red Team worked out of a chamber called the Pit, which was so secret that few people at NSA knew it existed, and even they couldn't enter without first passing through 2 combination lock doors. I'm here to tell you, I was part of the Pit. The Pit was our office. We were in cubicles and desks. I don't know how it got this fabled status, but I was a member of the group that was the first Red Team. We started learning penetration testing and trying to apply it to U.S. systems, DoD systems, classified systems. We called our office the Pit because we were trying to live the hacker lifestyle and we were trying to be trendy and cool. I grew my hair long. We had nicknames for everything. We came up with hacker handles, yada, yada, yada. The Pit exists. This is a set of office buildings that are right outside of BWI Airport in Baltimore, Maryland, and that building is there, and the Pit was in that corner. I can tell you more stories about that, but my time is up, and I would tell you about what's different about cryptography today. The biggest difference is something you can argue is non-repudiation. Confidentiality, which used to be mostly what you did for security, is now there's all this other stuff going on. Blah, 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 blah. Oh, credit. A lot of the images I got from an online museum called the Crypto Museum. Lots of interesting stuff there. If you ever get to DC, I recommend the International Spy Museum. You get to like crawl through ducks and do what spies used to do. It's really fun. And go up the VW Parkway and visit NSA's National Cryptologic Museum if you get the chance. And quickly a word from my sponsor, a company called Cybrary. They're doing free open source training, emphasis on free. You can sign up for a free account and you have access to hundreds, if not thousands of courses, thousands of hours of online video training. Cybrary.it. I encourage you highly to sign up. We're out of time. I'll take questions until they throw something at me. Anyone? Or I can go outside and we can talk. He's getting ready to throw. Yes. Mm-hmm. Nope. Could happen. Everything these days is breakable given enough time and given enough computing power. That's why I'm kind of partial to the one-time pad. You can't break it. We've sacrificed convenience and speed. We've sacrificed security for convenience and speed. All right, thanks a lot, guys. That's what that says. Thank you.